Hello listeners and welcome to the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host Casey and I am here with the first official episode of season 3 of the show, bringing you all of the ins and outs of controlling and coercive behaviour after finishing my master's in the psychology of coercive control. As I hope to bring more awareness to this topic through interviews with survivors and victims of coercive control, I thought it would be best to start with an episode on the topic itself. I am so happy to be back and to be bringing brand new content to you each Sunday. Thank you to everyone listening and to those who have supported me pre, during and post-degree. Now, on to the show. The battered women's movement, part of the broader women's rights movement, began to take shape in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It emerged as a response to the widespread issue of domestic violence, which until then had largely been ignored or accepted as a private family matter. The movement sought to raise awareness, provide support for victims, and push for legal reforms to protect women from abuse. The feminist movement of the 1960s laid the groundwork for the battered women's movement by challenging traditional gender roles and advocating for women's rights. Activists began to speak out about domestic violence, bringing the issue into public discourse. In 1971, the first women's shelter in the United States, Women's Advocates, was established in St. Paul, Minnesota. This was followed by the establishment of many more shelters across the country. These shelters provided refuge, support, and resources to women escaping abusive relationships. The 1970s also saw the introduction of legal reforms, aiming at protecting victims of domestic violence. For example, the introduction of restraining orders allowed victims to legally protect themselves from their abusers. The 1980s brought further legislative action, including the establishment of domestic violence units in police departments, mandatory arrest policies for domestic violence cases, and increased funding for shelters and victim services. A significant milestone was the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, or the VAWA, in 1994 in the United States. VAWA provided federal funding for investigations and prosecutions of violent crimes against women, established the Office on Violence Against Women, and created protections for victims. The movement not only helped to bring about legal changes, but also played a critical role in shifting societal attitudes towards domestic violence, framing it as a public issue rather than a private matter. Synthesizing the progress in research, legal reforms, and social movements, Evan Stark, amongst others, began to define abuse that was psychological and aimed to control people through non-violent means. Evan Stark was a forensic social worker, sociologist, and one of the leading experts on domestic violence, particularly known for his work on the concept of coercive control. I was lucky enough to interview Evan Stark on this podcast a few episodes back before he passed away sadly at the start of this year. Stark has had a significant impact on the field of domestic violence research and policy through his pioneering work in understanding the psychological and emotional dimensions of abuse. Stark's career spans decades of research, activism, and clinical work. His research has been crucial in shifting the focus of domestic violence from physical abuse to include the psychological and emotional dimensions of abuse, which often have devastating effect on victims. Evan Stark introduced the concept of coercive control in his landmark book Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life, which was published in 2007. Stark's definition of coercive control has been influential in changing how domestic violence is understood and addressed. Coercive control, according to Stark, refers to a pattern of behaviour designed to dominate and control a partner's life. Unlike physical violence, which may be sporadic, coercive control is characterised by an ongoing, systematic campaign of domination, isolation, and intimidation. It is a form of abuse that entraps women, primarily, in their relationships by stripping away their autonomy and ability to make decisions. That's not to say that other genders can't be impacted by coercive and controlling behaviour. Key elements of coercive control include isolation, where the abuser may isolate the victim from friends, family, and other sources of support, making it difficult for the victim to escape or seek help. The control of daily life, where the abuser exerts control over every aspect of the victim's life, including where they go, what they wear, who they see, and how they spend their money. Threats and intimidation, where the abuser uses threats both explicit and implicit to instill fear and maintain control, and this could include threats of physical harm, but also threats to take away children, ruin reputations, or harm loved ones and pets. monitoring and surveillance, where the abuser may monitor the victim's activities, communications, and whereabouts, ensuring that they are constantly aware of the victim's actions, and psychological abuse. Coercive control often involves psychological manipulation, including gaslighting, where the abuser makes the victim doubt their own reality or sanity. Stark argues that coercive control is a more accurate and encompassing term to describe the experiences of many victims of domestic abuse than physical violence alone. It highlights the ongoing nature of the abuse and its impact on the victim's freedom and sense of self. Coercive control is a serious form of domestic abuse, and various countries have enacted or are considering laws to address it. The legal frameworks vary significantly, with some countries specifically targeting coercive control and others addressing it within broader domestic abuse legislation. England and Wales were among the first jurisdictions to criminalise coercive control explicitly. The Serious Crime Act 2015, which came into force in 2015, makes it an offence to engage in controlling or coercive behaviour in an intimate or family relationship. The law defines coercive control as a pattern of behaviour that has a serious effect on the victim, causing them to fear violence or feel alarmed or distressed to the extent that it affects their day-to-day activities. The offence can result in a prison sentence of up to 5 years. Scotland introduced a pioneering law that criminalises psychological domestic abuse, including coercive control, in 2018. The law defines abusive behaviour as behaviour that is violent, threatening, or intimidating, as well as behaviour that isolates, restricts freedom, or is degrading. Offenders can face up to 14 years in prison. In Northern Ireland, the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act came into effect in 2021 and includes provisions for coercive control. This law includes a broad definition of abusive behaviour that covers physical, psychological, and emotional abuse, with a specific focus on patterns of controlling behaviour. The maximum penalty for coercive control is 14 years in prison. France introduced measures to combat domestic violence, including psychological abuse and controlling behaviour, under a broader legal framework. The law does not explicitly use the term coercive control, but it criminalises behaviours that aim to dominate or intimidate a partner. Penalties vary based on the specific actions and their consequences. The legal recognition of coercive control is an evolving area, with some countries like the UK and Ireland leading the way by explicitly criminalising it. Other jurisdictions address coercive control within broader domestic abuse laws, though there is growing momentum globally to recognise and tackle this form of abuse more directly. Despite various laws and legislations, the invisible nature of coercive control makes it increasingly difficult to prosecute, even when there are cases being tried in countries where this type of abuse is outlawed. Sally Challen, for example, is a significant and highly publicised legal case in the UK that has had a profound impact on the understanding and legal treatment of domestic abuse, particularly in relation to coercive control and Section 76 of the Serious Crime Act 2015. Sally Challen, born in 1954, was married to Richard Challen for over 30 years. The couple had 2 sons. Throughout their marriage, Sally endured years of emotional and psychological abuse from Richard, which is now recognised as coercive control. Richard was described as a controlling, manipulative, and unfaithful husband. He isolated Sally from her friends and family, controlled her finances, and subjected her to repeated infidelity and gaslighting. The cumulative effect of these behaviours severely affected Sally's mental health and sense of reality. On August 14, 2010, after years of enduring this abuse, Sally Challen killed her husband, Richard, by striking him over the head 20 times with a hammer at their home in Claygate, Surrey. After the killing, Sally left a note on Richard's body that read, "I love you," then attempted suicide by driving to Beachy Head, a known suicide spot, but was found by the police and arrested. In 2011, Sally Challen was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years, later reduced to 18 years on appeal. During the trial, the defence argued that Sally was suffering from a mental disorder at the time of the killing, but the focus was mainly on her depression rather than the impact of years of coercive control. The jury rejected the defence of diminished responsibility, and Sally was found guilty of murder. Following Sally's conviction, her case became a focal point for campaigners against domestic abuse, particularly those advocating for the recognition of coercive control as a serious form of abuse. The concept of coercive control had been recognised in law in England and Wales only in 2015 under the Serious Crime Act, which was not in place at the time of Sally's trial. Sally's defence team, supported by campaigners, argued that the original trial had failed to adequately consider the years of psychological abuse that Sally had endured. They contended that the new understanding of coercive control provided a crucial context that should have been considered in her defense. In February 2019, Sally Challen's new legal team won the right to appeal her murder conviction, arguing that new psychiatric evidence and the recognition of coercive control as a criminal offence constituted grounds for an appeal. On February 28, 2019, the Court of Appeal quashed Sally Challen's murder conviction, ruling that her original trial had not taken into account the years of coercive control and psychological abuse she had suffered. The court recognised that these factors were crucial in understanding her actions and the state of mind she was in at the time of the killing. The appeal court ordered a retrial, but on June 7, 2019, the Crown Prosecution Service, or CPS, accepted Sally's plea to the lesser charge of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, acknowledging that her mental condition at the time of the killing had been significantly affected by Richard's abusive behaviour. Sally Challen was sentenced to 9 years and 4 months for manslaughter, but because she had already served nearly that amount of time in prison, she was released immediately. The Sally Challen case is considered a landmark in British legal history. It highlighted the devastating effects of coercive control and led to a greater understanding of how psychological abuse can drive victims to extreme actions. The case also brought attention to the importance of considering the broader context of domestic abuse in legal proceedings. Sally's case has had a significant influence on public and legal discourse around domestic abuse, particularly in reinforcing the need to recognise coercive control as a serious and damaging form of abuse that can have profound effects on victims' mental health and actions. The case is often cited in discussions about the need for legal reform and better protection for victims of coercive control and domestic abuse. Another case, very different, that also used Section 76 of the Serious Crime Act in England and Wales to get a successful conviction, was the case of Angel Lynn. The case of Angel Lynn is a tragic and highly publicised story in the UK which has drawn attention to issues of coercive control, domestic abuse, and the legal consequences of such behaviours. Angel Lynn, a young woman from Loughborough, Leicestershire, was 19 years old when a devastating incident occurred in September 2020. Before this, Angel had been in a relationship with Che Boskill, a man described by her family and prosecutors as controlling and abusive. The relationship was marked by coercive and controlling behaviour, including emotional abuse and intimidation. On September 17, 2020, Angel Lynn was involved in a serious and life-changing incident. The details of what led up to this incident reveal a pattern of coercive control. On the day of the incident, Angel had an argument with Boskill. During this altercation, she was forcibly taken by Boskill and another man, Rocco Sansom, into a van. CCTV showed footage of Angel being picked up by Boskill and forcibly put into the van as she tried to walk away. As the van travelled at high speed along the A6 near Loughborough, Angel fell out of the vehicle, sustaining catastrophic injuries. She was found on the roadside with severe head injuries and was rushed to hospital. Injuries were so acute that she was left paralysed, unable to speak, and requiring 24-hour care. Following the incident, Che Boskill and Rocco Sansom were arrested and charged. Boskill faced multiple charges, including kidnapping, coercive and controlling behaviour, and perverting the course of justice. Sansom, who was driving the van at the time, was also charged with kidnapping. Boskill was found guilty of kidnapping and coercive control. The coercive control charge was based on his behaviour throughout the relationship, where he had exerted significant psychological pressure on Angel, isolating her from family and friends, and controlling various aspects of her life. Sansom was found guilty of kidnapping, but was not involved in the coercive control aspect. In January 2022, Che Boskill was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison for kidnapping and coercive control. His sentence was later increased to 12 years by the Court of Appeal after a review found that the original sentence was unduly lenient. Rocco Sansom received 21 months for his role in the kidnapping. The case of Angel Lynn shocked the public and highlighted the severe consequences of coercive control. The incident drew significant media attention, with many people expressing outrage over the level of violence and control that Angel had been subjected to. The case also raised questions about the adequacy of legal protections for victims of coercive control and the need for harsher penalties and for those who commit such crimes. The increase in Boskill's sentence by the Court of Appeal was seen as a reflection of the seriousness with which the judiciary views coercive control and its devastating impact on victims. As of the latest updates, Angel Lynn remains in a severely incapacitated state due to the injuries sustained in the fall. Her family continues to care for her, and they have been vocal about the need for greater awareness and action against coercive control and domestic abuse. The Angel Lynn case underscores the dangers of coercive control and the need for society and legal systems to take such behaviour seriously. It also serves as a tragic reminder of the potentially life-threatening consequences of domestic abuse and the importance of supporting victims before situations escalate to such extremes, as seen with this case and the case of Sally Challen. The Angel Lynn case saw a successful prosecution of coercive control largely due to statements from family, friends and work colleagues regarding Bowskill's behaviour towards Angel, but also due to the electronic evidence gathered during the investigation, where text messages, voice recordings and voicemails provided a clear picture of coercive control for prosecutors. However, in some cases of coercive control, where this evidence is not so easily gathered or presented, there may not be successful convictions, again, given the invisible nature of this form of abuse. Whilst coercive control is a pattern of behaviour designed to dominate and subjugate a person, stripping away their autonomy, self-worth and sense of safety, it is most commonly discussed in the context of intimate partner relationships, especially as most of the legal reforms at the moment reflect that context. The concept of coercive control, however, can extend to various other settings, including workplaces, cults, sports teams, extremist groups, gangs, and human trafficking, and so much more. In the workplace, managers or co-workers may use threats, intimidation, or manipulation to maintain control over employees. This can include threats to job loss, demotion, or other punitive measures. Employees may be isolated from co-workers, denied access to essential resources, or deliberately excluded from communication and decision-making processes. Overly controlling supervision that strips employees of their autonomy, forcing them to seek approval for even minor decisions, can be a form of coercive control. Bullying, verbal abuse, or gaslighting in the workplace can undermine an employee's confidence and sense of reality, making them feel powerless. Employees might be coerced into working excessive hours, taking on additional responsibilities without compensation, or performing tasks outside their job description under the threat of negative consequences. The manifestation of coercive control in cults may include cult leaders isolating members from their family and friends, severing ties with the outside world to ensure loyalty and control. Cults typically demand complete obedience and control over all aspects of members' lives, including their thoughts, beliefs, relationships, and finances, also known as totalitarian control. Leaders use psychological manipulation, indoctrination, and brainwashing techniques to instill fear, dependence, and unwavering loyalty in members. Cult members may be exploited for labor, money, or sexual favors, often under the guise of fulfilling a higher purpose or achieving spiritual enlightenment. Members who disobey or question the cults are often subjected to severe punishments, ostracism, shunning, or threats of spiritual or physical harm. The manifestation of coercive control in sports teams may include coaches or team leaders exerting excessive control over athletes, demanding complete obedience and compliance with unreasonable demands. Athletes might be isolated from family and friends, encouraged to prioritize the team over personal relationships, and discouraged from seeking outside support. Athletes may be subjected to verbal abuse, humiliation, or extreme psychological pressure to perform, often under the threat of being benched, cut from the team, or publicly shamed. In some cases, athletes may be forced into playing through injuries, subjected to extreme training regimes, or exposed to dangerous practices, such as taking illegal performance-enhancing drugs, all in the name of success or team loyalty. Athletes, particularly at the amateur or collegiate level, may be exploited for their talents without proper compensation, all while being pressured to conform to the demands of coaches or team authorities. And this is without talking about the sexual exploitation and abuse that has recently been highlighted to be rife in areas such as gymnastics. In extremist groups, the manifestation of coercive control may include members being subjected to intense ideological indoctrination, which controls their thoughts and beliefs, making them view the group's ideology as the only truth. Extremist groups often isolate members from broader society, convincing them that outsiders are enemies or untrustworthy. I'm sure at this point we are all realizing that these also sound like abusive relationships, cults, and toxic workplaces. In extremist groups, members are often kept in line through fear and punishment, including physical harm, social ostracization, and threats to their loved ones. With gangs, the manifestation of coercive control includes using fear and intimidation to control members, ensuring loyalty and compliance with gang rules. Members are encouraged to cut ties with family and friends outside the gang, fostering a sense of belonging only within the gang environment. Gang members are often exploited for criminal activities such as drug trafficking, theft, or violence, with little regard for their well-being. Disloyalty is met with severe consequences, including violence, public humiliation, or even death, making it extremely difficult for gang members to leave. Gang leaders often use psychological manipulation to control members, convincing them that the gang is their only family and that leaving is impossible. Manifestation of coercive control in human trafficking cases can include victims of human trafficking being subjected to physical violence, sexual abuse, and psychological manipulation to maintain control. Traffickers isolate victims from their support networks, often moving them to unfamiliar places where they cannot seek help. Victims may be trapped in situations of debt bondage, where they are forced to work to pay off insurmountable debt to the traffickers, often under the threat of violence. Traffickers use threats against victims and their families to prevent escape or resistance, creating a climate of constant fear. Traffickers often control every aspect of a victim's life, including their movements, communication, and access to basic needs, stripping away their autonomy. Coercive control in these different contexts shares common characteristics: the use of fear, intimidation, isolation, psychological manipulation, and the exploitation of individuals to dominate and control. Whether in intimate relationships, workplaces, or larger groups like cults or gangs, the impact of coercive control is profound, often leading to long-lasting psychological trauma, loss of autonomy, and a deeply entrenched sense of powerlessness. Understanding how coercive control operates in these various settings helps to broaden the recognition of this form of abuse and informs the development of interventions and legal protections across different areas of society. There are certain laws here in England, Wales, and the UK overall that criminalise coercive and controlling behaviour in other areas, such as workplaces, even though the language of coercive control is not used explicitly. Section 76 of the Serious Crime Act is a landmark provision in English and Welsh law that explicitly criminalises controlling and coercive behaviour in intimate or family relationships. This is different to the Domestic Abuse Act from 2021, which further strengthens protections against domestic abuse, including coercive control, by expanding definitions and providing additional legal tools for victims. Then there's the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, which requires employers to ensure, as far as reasonably practicable, that health, safety, and welfare of their employees is maintained at work. While the Act does not explicitly mention coercion, employers have a duty to protect employees from risks to their health and safety, which can include psychological harm due to bullying, harassment, or exploitation in the workplace. Employers are encouraged to have policies and procedures in place that address workplace bullying and harassment, and this can include elements of coercive control. The Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015 includes measures to prevent individuals from being drawn into terrorism and addresses issues related to radicalisation and extremist behaviours. However, it doesn't specifically criminalise coercive control within extremist groups. Part of the UK government's counter-terrorism strategy, PREVENT, focuses on stopping people from becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. This includes recognising and responding to coercive control tactics used by extremist groups to recruit and retain members. The Modern Slavery Act 2015 consolidates offences relating to human trafficking and slavery. It criminalises activities such as forced labour, servitude, and other forms of exploitation, which are often maintained through coercive control. The Act recognises that victims of trafficking may be controlled through non-physical means, such as psychological coercion, threats, and manipulation. While Section 76 of the Serious Crime Act 2015 and the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 provide robust frameworks for addressing coercive control in intimate and familial relationships, there is currently no specific legislation in the UK that addresses coercive control within groups such as cults, gangs, or extremist organisations. Coercive control in groups such as cults often mirrors the pattern seen in domestic abuse, but operates on a broader, often more insidious scale. These groups exert control over members' beliefs, behaviours, and social interactions, using isolation, manipulation, and fear to maintain power. The current focus of coercive control laws on domestic abuse, while vital, leaves a significant gap that can allow spiritual abuse to take place unchecked. This gap is particularly concerning in religious or spiritual contexts where coercive control can be just as damaging, but harder to detect and address under existing legal frameworks. Expanding the legal recognition of coercive control to include non-domestic settings, particularly those involving spiritual or religious coercion, is crucial for protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation and abuse. An example of current spiritual exploitation unfolding into a historical case of exploitation on a monumental scale is the case of the Good News Morning Church in Kenya. Paul Mackenzie Nthenge was originally a taxi driver before he transitioned into religious preaching. Not much is known publicly about his early life or what led him to become a religious leader. In the early 2000s, Mackenzie founded the Good News International Church in Malindi, Kenya. His church started as a seemingly conventional evangelical Christian group, but gradually took on more extreme and apocalyptic teachings. Over time, Mackenzie's teachings became increasingly radical. He claimed to have received divine revelations and positioned himself as a prophet with a direct connection to God. He preached a strict and apocalyptic version of Christianity, warning his followers about the imminent end of the world. Mackenzie emphasized that only those who followed his teachings would achieve salvation. These teachings involved rejecting all modern institutions, including education, healthcare, and government. He advocated for fasting as a form of spiritual purification, which eventually escalated to the point where he encouraged his followers to starve themselves to death as a means of meeting Jesus. His doctrine included severe anti-establishment rhetoric, portraying the outside world as corrupt and evil, thus isolating his followers from society and making them entirely dependent on him for spiritual guidance. Mackenzie used classic cult tactics to control his followers, including isolation, manipulation, fear, and psychological coercion. He convinced them to sever ties with their families and surrender their possessions, leaving them vulnerable and entirely dependent on the cult. Followers were led to believe that death by starvation was a form of martyrdom that would guarantee them a place in heaven, a belief that Mackenzie manipulated to exert control over life and death within his cult. In April 2023, after concerns were raised by locals and some survivors, authorities raided the Shakahola forest where the cult was based. They discovered mass graves containing the bodies of dozens of Mackenzie's followers, many of whom were children. As of mid-2023, over 200 bodies had been recovered from these graves, with many more believed to be buried in the area. The victims had died from starvation, following Mackenzie's orders, though the full scale of the deaths is still being uncovered. During the investigation, there were reports and suspicions that some of the victims may have been subjected to organ harvesting. These suspicions arose due to the condition of some of the bodies and the nature of the graves. Kenyan authorities indicated that they were investigating the possibility that organs were harvested from some of the victims, which would point to a much more sinister operation involving human trafficking and illegal organ trade. However, as of the latest updates, these allegations had not been conclusively proven. The investigations were ongoing, with authorities exploring all possibilities, given the scale of the operation and the number of bodies involved. The potential involvement in organ trafficking suggests that Mackenzie's cult might have been part of a larger underground criminal network, exploiting his followers not just for control, but also for profit through human trafficking. Human trafficking, particularly for organ harvesting, is a known issue in parts of Africa where vulnerable populations are sometimes exploited for their organs, which are sold on the black market. Paul Mackenzie was arrested in April 2023 and charged with various crimes including terrorism, murder, and child abuse. His trial, which is currently unfolding, has been closely watched by people around the world. Kenyan authorities, including President William Ruto, have strongly condemned Mackenzie's actions, describing them as acts of terrorism. The government has vowed to crack down on extremist religious groups and cults operating in the country. The case has triggered widespread horror and condemnation both within Kenya and internationally. It has led to calls for tighter regulation of religious organisations in Kenya and more robust protections against cult-like groups. There is also increased scrutiny on how authorities handled previous warnings about Mackenzie's activities, with questions about whether more could have been done to prevent the tragedy. All in all, there is a critical need worldwide for religious exploitation to be recognised and included in worldwide policies and legislations. Coercive control laws need to be adopted more widely around the world, with a focus on expanding current controlling and coercive behaviour laws to include other contexts, such as high-demand groups. As I have now concluded my Masters in the Psychology of Coercive Control, I hope to bring more of this as a topic into the Cult Vault podcast, and I'm excited for you to join me on that journey. Thank you to those who are still here with me, listening weekly, interacting on Patreon, and leaving reviews. You have my eternal gratitude. I'm your host, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault podcast.